Mr. President, the pro-life movement is about love, compassion, dignity, and respect. Nebraska is a pro-life state, and Nebraska has been a leader in the pro-life movement. In 2010, Nebraska was the first state to pass a law with regard to pain-capable fetuses, and effectively made it so that you had a 20-week prohibition on abortion, protecting those babies after 20 weeks because they could feel pain. Last year, Nebraska again showed the nation what we could do in the pro-life movement. We were the first state to pass a pro-life ballot initiative. And while doing that, we were able to prevent the pro-abortion lobby from passing a really heinous pro-abortion ballot initiative. The Pro-Abortion Forces ballot initiative would have essentially enshrined in our Constitution not only the right to abortion, but would have allowed abortion up until essentially the moment of birth. It was incredibly radical. And I'm very proud of our state. The people of Nebraska took our current law and kept that on the ballot and defeated the pro-abortion's very radical ballot initiative. We have the opportunity here in the Senate to be able to continue to uphold the dignity of unborn children. There's a couple of bills I want to talk about. They both have the word abortion in them, but they're really not about abortion. They're about that love and compassion, that dignity and respect. The first is the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Act. So in 2002, Congress passed bipartisan legislation that said that children who survive an abortion are to be treated as people under the law. Now, to me, that seems a little crazy that we had to do that, but we actually passed that. It seemed common sense that if you're born, you're a person, you're protected under our laws here in the United States. Sadly, that's not the case. In that 2002 law, it didn't say that the child had to receive care. And so what we've seen in the abortion industry is that when there's a botched abortion, that baby oftentimes will just be born alive but then left to die of exposure. It's absolutely barbaric, absolutely heinous. And that's what the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act does. It requires medical treatment to be given to those babies. So if a baby girl is born in a botched abortion attempt, that baby girl gets the medical attention it needs so that she can survive and grow up. Now, you may say, well, this sounds ridiculous. Why wouldn't that happen? Well, as I said, it does happen in the abortion industry. Melissa Oden's mother was pressured into trying to have an abortion at a hospital in Sioux City, Iowa. Melissa was born alive, and thank goodness there was a nurse there who then took her to the NICU so she could get the medical attention so that she could survive and grow up to be the woman she is today. Melissa was later adopted and has contributed to our country. That's part of what we in the pro-life movement need to do, is make sure we're defending the rights of these babies. We have another opportunity as well, and again, the name of the bill has abortion in it, but it's really not about abortion. It's about protecting the dignity of unborn children. In this case, it's unborn children who are killed in that abortion. Just a few years ago, the remains of over 2,000 aborted babies were discovered in a home in Indiana. And many Americans were shocked to find out that children who are aborted are often just disposed of. Their remains are treated like medical waste. And that's just absolutely fundamentally wrong. These babies deserve the dignity that every other person has. And so, in a few days, I'm going to introduce the Dignity for Aborted Children's Act. And what my bill will do is require the abortion industry to treat with dignity and respect the remains of these aborted children. That they will get the same dignity and respect as any human being who dies. Finally, I want to recognize that we've got the March for Life coming up on Friday. I want to say thank you to all of the marchers who are going to be here to be able to demonstrate our movement's commitment to love, compassion, dignity, and respect. Your advocacy plays a critical role in making sure that we help save the lives of all these unborn babies. When we talk about the most vulnerable, who could be more vulnerable than a baby that hasn't been born yet, that we can't hear that little girl, little boy's voice yet? These marchers will be here to be that voice for those little babies. So thank you for the work that you're doing to be able to continue to get our message out about love and compassion, dignity and respect. We need to remind all of our fellow citizens that these little babies deserve the same protections that we all have as citizens of the United States. It's about extending basic human rights to some of the most vulnerable among us. And I appreciate the work that all these pro-life advocates will be doing to be able to help carry our message out this weekend. Working together, we can defend life and empower women. And with that, Mr. President, I yield back my time.
Senator from Iowa.
52 years ago today, Roe v. Wade was decided by the United States Supreme Court. Approximately 1 year before that, I was a member of the Iowa legislature, and that legislature attempted to repeal Iowa's law of decades old, and that vote in the House of Representatives was 44 to 44. So obviously our bill was not, that bill was not adopted, and our ban on abortion continued for a year until Roe v. Wade. I was one of those 44 that voted to retain the law that had been on the books for a long period of time. Well, a lot of history since then. We're still fighting this issue. So this bill before the United States Senate now is a very important bill to express what life in the womb is all about. Dr. Willard Cates, the director of abortion surveillance at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in 1981 referred to the survival of a baby after an attempted abortion as, quote unquote, the dreaded complication. Now, I happen to call that dreaded complication a miracle. While it may be a troubling truth for some people to hear that, there are babies who survive attempted abortions. In 2024, the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology analyzed almost 14,000 late-term abortions and found over 11% resulted in live births. However, because we lack reliable federal and state abortions data, we don't know the number of babies who survive an attempted abortion and are born alive each year in the United States. When an abortion results in the live birth of a child, that child should be entitled to quality health care under the law. Tragically, that isn't always the case. During my time in Congress, I've heard a number of stories from abortion survivors regarding their health struggles and the lack of care they received following failed abortions. Melissa Olden, for example, was born alive in 1977 and left to die in a bucket of formaldehyde in a utility closet before being saved by 2 nurses. She's an advocate for children who come into this world the same way she did. Her message for moms considering abortion is this, and I quote, "There is hope for you and your child even after an attempted abortion. You aren't alone," end of quote. While children born alive are already recognized as persons under the law, there is not a federal law on the books to penalize abortionists who actively kill or passively deny care to babies who survive abortions. These precious babies deserve justice. That's why I've joined my colleagues in introducing the legislation that we entitled Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. This legislation requires any child born alive following an attempted abortion receive the same level of care as any other newborn who was born alive at the same stage of development. It doesn't and should not matter if a child is born in a hospital, a maternity ward, or in an abortion clinic. In either case, this is a baby, and that reality ought to convict each of us in our hearts and move us to compassion and to action. Our bill would bring justice for babies who survive abortions and are born into this world. Under our current legal system, human lives viewed as unwanted are treated as dispensable. No matter what each of us may think about abortion, we must speak and vote with unity to protect children outside of the womb. In Congress, my colleagues and I have reached across the aisle to protect children in many other contexts, and I ask my colleagues to do the same here. I yield.
Mr. President,
Senator from Mississippi.
this is an incredibly special week for pro-life Americans. We have welcomed back a life-affirming administration with the second inauguration of President Donald Trump. Both chambers of Congress are united in our pursuit of common-sense legislation to protect the most vulnerable Americans among us with a vote on the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act. And this Friday, we will join thousands of pro-life Americans who faithfully participate in the 52nd annual March for Life in our nation's capital. The National March for Life always reminds us of why we continue to fight for stronger protections of our unborn children and for their mothers. But thankfully, The march also serves as a bright reminder of the progress we've made as a movement. Now, thanks to efforts led by my fellow Mississippians in the governor's office, attorney general's office, and state legislature, we live in the Dobbs era. The entire process that brought us to this historical overturning of Roe v. Wade almost 3 years ago began with the introduction of a bill in the Mississippi State Legislature called the Gestational Age Act. My dear friend, Representative Becky Curry, is responsible for introducing this legislation, which turned out to be a catalyst for such great change in our nation. I would like to read into the record of resolution honoring her in this role in history that she plays. Today, I am introducing a Senate resolution honoring the Mississippi Gestational Age Act. Whereas on January 15, 2018, Mississippi State Representative Becky Curry of Brookhaven, Mississippi, introduced the Gestational Age Act to protect unborn children from elective abortions after 15 weeks gestation. Whereas on March the 19th, 2018, the Gestational Age Act was passed by the Mississippi State Legislature, approved by Mississippi Governor Phil Bryant, and enacted into law. Whereas in May 2021, the United States Supreme Court agreed to review Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health, a challenge to the constitutionality of the Gestational Age Act, where the question before the court was whether all pre-viability prohibitions on elective abortions are unconstitutional. And whereas on June the 24th, 2022, the United States Supreme Court issued a historical decision in Dobbs versus Jackson's Women's Health, holding that the Constitution does not confer a right to abortion. Roe and Causey must be overruled, and the authority to regulate abortion must be returned to the people and their elected representatives. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the Senate expresses profound gratitude to Mississippi State Representative Becky Curry for introducing the catalyst that ultimately brought about the historical victory of overturning Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey, and honors life-affirming states across the country that have enacted laws aimed to value and protect the inherent dignity of every mother and unborn child. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Oh, I know. Don't you worry about that. I'm all over it.
That's the original.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I want to start by thanking my friend and colleague, Senator Langford from Oklahoma, and organizing a colloquy here, recognizing the importance of protecting the lives of the unborn, and to bring us together today to make a statement about the importance of standing up for the right to life. I look forward to joining my constituents back in Texas on Saturday, later this week, at the Texas Rally for Life, where I will be honored to speak. It's no mistake that the Declaration of Independence recognizes the importance of the right to life. Life, liberty, are among the unalienable rights that have been guaranteed by our Constitution, but more importantly, by our Creator. Now 3 years have passed since
the Supreme Court struck down Roe versus Wade, which was judge-made law, drawing an arbitrary line at when abortions would be available or when they would not be available, and excluding any kind of participation from the American people across this great land of ours of 330 plus million people about what they thought. Well, this decision returned the authority where it should have been in the first place until the Supreme Court ruled in Roe versus Wade back to the states, because now the elected officials in the various states are going to be accountable to their constituents at where that line is drawn. All the states and thus all the American people through their elected representatives in their state legislatures have an opportunity to weigh in. And I know that this can be a controversial topic. It's fraught with emotion and strong feelings. But it's important to point out that notwithstanding where you think the line ought to be drawn at when an abortion should be available in America, that it is the Democratic Party that is extreme and out of touch with the American people on this issue. Our Democratic colleagues have made clear that they support abortion on demand, anytime, anywhere, any place, funded by the taxpayer even, up until the moment of birth, and in some instances, even after birth. This week we will vote on the Born Alive Abortion Survivors Protection Act, which would guarantee certain basic medical care to children who are born as a result of an unsuccessful abortion. In other words, if they're born alive, are they left to die, or are they given the basic medical care that any infant would be given? Well, my Democratic colleagues are on record for saying they think medical care is a basic human right. I heard the senator from Vermont this morning in the budget hearing talking about a fundamental right to health care. Well, we are about to see whether they will vote to deny basic medical care to infants who survive abortions. If there's a basic right to health care in this country, will it be afforded to the most vulnerable of our citizens, children born alive as a result of an unsuccessful abortion, or not? It's been said before that by many great minds that civilizations should be measured by the way we treat our most vulnerable members. It's hard for me to imagine anyone more vulnerable than an infant who's been born, who isn't wanted by his or her parents. To deny protection to these helpless newborns amounts to infanticide, and it is a tragedy that this is legal in our country. If America is to be truly great, we should without question be willing to at least provide basic medical care to these innocent children. I would hope our Democratic colleagues would examine their conscience and realize that there are more important things than politics in this world. In the end, we all have to live with our own conscience. And I would hope they would join us in voting for this legislation to protect the right to life for these, our most vulnerable citizens.
The senator from Oklahoma.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the following interns be granted floor privileges until May the 30th, 2025. Henson Peed and Madeline Becker.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I have one request for a committee to meet during today's session of the Senate. It's been approved by the majority and the minority leaders.
With that, duly noted. Thought he asked.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, for the past 45 minutes or so, my colleagues have come to this floor to be able to talk about a bill that is coming soon that we'll actually vote on at the bottom of the hour, this hour. It's a bill that we talked about for several years and it's been debated some. It's about what happens if a child survives a botched abortion. Now I'm going to talk about it a little bit. I've got some other colleagues that are going to step in a moment. That I want to talk a little bit more about this because this seems to be an incredibly misunderstood issue. It's interesting, we most often talk about a botched medical procedure, that if there's a botched medical procedure, someone dies. This is literally the opposite, that there was a botched medical procedure and someone lives. The whole debate is that botched medical procedure that was supposed to take the life of a child ends up actually delivering that child, and now you have a living, breathing child crying on the table, fully viable. The question is, what do we do now? Well, yesterday, my Democratic colleague spent an hour on the floor saying that child should die. I disagree. In all of our conversation about abortion, and we have various opinions in this room, and quite frankly, across the country, we have various opinions about when is a child a child. Some people believe a child is a child when they have unique DNA that's different than the mom, different than the dad. Conceptions occurred, cell division has happened. That's quite frankly how science defines life, is unique replicating cell division. Some people believe that's a child. Some people say, well, it's not a child until there's a heartbeat. Some people would say, well, it's not a child until there's actually a developed nervous system. Some people would say it's not a child until the Roe standard that I hear very often. That's a viable child that could survive outside the womb, which is about 21 weeks of gestation. And I have a lot of my colleagues who will say, well, I want to go back to the Roe standard. But I've yet to have a colleague come to me and say, I'm okay with abortion after delivery. That's what we're talking about in this. Now, it's an incredibly small group that we're discussing here. But if we're talking about a common ground issue, why wouldn't this be a common ground issue? Earlier this week, we found a common ground issue on the issue that's very contentious in this body about immigration. We've had a wide variety of opinions about how we do enforcement for immigration, but we found an area to say if a person has crossed the border, committed multiple crimes in the United States, they should be detained. We found bipartisan agreement on that. We don't agree on everything, but we at least agreed on that one. You realize that's the first bill like that we passed in decades. That's actually passed. It's going to be signed by the president. We're making law on that issue where we found simple common ground on a small niche issue related to immigration. Well, this is a small niche issue on a very contentious issue about abortion. What do we do when a child is actually delivered instead of destroyed in the womb? That is a viable child. Now, some of my Democratic colleagues have said this never happens. Well, I'd love to introduce you to a friend of mine named Melissa Oden. Melissa Oden, when her mom was 19 years old, was compelled by her family to have an abortion. She had an abortion, her mom did, delivered that child. The child was delivered, and then literally the baby was set aside into the medical waste of that procedure at the hospital. The nurse, then a few minutes later, as she's cleaning up after the procedure, noticed the medical waste was crying and was breathing. And so the nurse literally scooped up this child and took the child from that room to the emergency room where she survived. Now, folks early on said she would be blind or she would have major heart conditions, she would have everything else. I wish you could meet Melissa. She's amazing. She's fully healthy. In fact, it was years later that she learned her adopted mom had adopted her because her birth mom literally didn't know she still existed. Her birth mom was never told that actually that abortion, quote unquote, didn't work. That child survived. They've since reconnected, Melissa and her birth mom. and her birth mom, with deep regret, thinking about this beautiful child in front of her, that life was almost destroyed. In fact, was planned to be destroyed. Listen, this is not just an academic issue. This is real. Again, it's rare, but the question is, what do we do in those rare situations? How do we track this? How do we engage on it? I would ask any American, if there is a child laying on the table in an operating room crying, what do we do then? I don't know many Americans who would say, kill it. But here's what happens. In a botched abortion in America right now, when a child is actually delivered rather than destroyed in the womb, when literally there was a medical mistake that didn't take the life of the child, but instead delivered that child into life, when that occurs, the current practice is everyone kind of backs away and allows the child to die on the table by exposure. Because it is against American law in every single state to take the life of a child. But if everybody just steps back and watches the child die, that's okay. My Democratic colleagues came to the floor yesterday and said, this is already illegal. Why are we even discussing this? This is already illegal. You can't have infanticide in America. And I would say that's correct. It is already illegal to do infanticide. But what is still allowed is a tiny little loophole that if an abortion was botched, everyone can just back away and watch the child die. They do not have to give that child medical care. That's quite a loophole. And it's painful for me to even have to have this conversation in a nation like ours. Of all the things that we could talk about right now, why do we even have to discuss what to do with a child on a table in an operating room crying? Why is this even a conversation? So, we're bringing a bill to the floor today to be able to fix this. This is a bill we've talked about multiple times in this body, but it should be the absolute easiest common ground piece to face. Which of us, standing in that operating room, would look at a crying child and would say, ignore it? If we wouldn't say it there, we shouldn't say that here. So, I'll be back in a few moments, Mr. President. I have other colleagues that want to be able to speak to this issue. But I have some fact and myth that I want to do side by side with some of my Democratic colleagues who came to be able to share their perspective on this. And I want to be able to lay some things side by side to say what this bill actually does, not what the myth is and what it's actually being told about. In the meantime, I would encourage members of this body to be able to look up my friend Melissa Oden. You can look her up online if you want to. You can see her beautiful picture and read her story for yourself, because she's not the only one with that same story. She's just one of many that has that story. Just not many are willing to be able to step out and speak, knowing that their life was intended to be taken, though today they're still smiling and talking about the value of every single life. With that, I yield the floor.
The senior senator from Louisiana.
Mr. President, the bill we're discussing today should be really straightforward. A child who survives a failed abortion attempt should receive life-saving medical care. We're talking about not an abstraction. We're talking about a living, breathing person, a little girl, a little boy, who comes into the world after a failed abortion. And they shouldn't just be like put to the side and allowed to die. They deserve the care that they need to survive. Imagine if there was a week later and they were going home from the hospital and there was a car wreck. You would rush them to the hospital, you would do everything to help that child survive. Once that child is born, it should be straightforward. We should be helping the child survive. And there is no difference in the value and dignity of a child, of a person, as to whether or not they were originally wanted or not. Once they are born, they have that natural right, which we all have, that is discussed in our Declaration of Independence, our right to life, to liberty. I'm a physician, and I was trained to take the best care of a patient regardless of the circumstances that brought them before me. And it may have been someone that society didn't particularly care for. Didn't matter. That's my patient. I'm going to do everything I possibly can to help that patient survive and to thrive. That should be the ethic, and we should enshrine it into law. But, Mr. President, I'm a little struck. My Democratic colleagues offer a variety of excuses to justify opposing this bill. This is kind of like an inconvenient truth. Botched abortions happen. Now, my Democratic colleagues refuse to acknowledge that infanticide, withholding care to a baby who is born alive, is horrific and wrong. But we do know that failed abortions occur. The Senate Health Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pension, heard powerful testimony last year from Melissa Oden. Melissa survived an abortion and would have been left to die if not for a courageous NICU nurse, a neonatal intensive care unit nurse. A life that could have been wasted now is used to advocate for those who do not have a voice. Innocent children should not have to hope that there is a NICU nurse like Melissa's who will do everything possible to save their life. Mr. President, this is a vote in support of basic human decency. Every child deserves to have a chance to live. And I urge my colleagues, if you believe in prayer, pray on that. If you don't believe in prayer, look at the Declaration of Independence. We are endowed with the natural right of life and of liberty. Reflect on that, support this bill. With that, I yield.